Again, talking about the Enlightenment, aka the Age of Reason when combined with the Scientific Revolution. Today, we are going to do a little chart over some of the main philosophers or thinkers that you read about yesterday. Take a few notes. It's really not going to be that bad. The PowerPoint's only like 8 or 9 slides. Once that's done, I got a short video, a little crash course. And that'll kind of wrap up the Enlightenment. Although tomorrow we are going to do a really short, really easy assignment where you're going to read some of the writings of these philosophers and just answer a few basic comprehension questions. That assignment will be due on Friday. But on Friday, I really don't have much planned since it's going to be a short day. So if you don't manage to finish the assignment tomorrow in class, which I'm sure you will if you work on it, then you can of course finish that on Friday. Again, we could try to shove more into this week, but I'm trying to take it slow. And I really want you to understand the significance of this philosophical movement, and also some of the key thinkers that kind of helped create this movement. Again, this is the framework. This is the school of thought that a lot of people were advocating during the 15, 16, especially 1700s. Which I guess you could say helped to inspire some of the political revolutions like the American revolutions that were going to come and end up changing the world, I guess you could say. So that is what we are doing. Take some good notes, fill in the chart that we are about to create in your notebook. This will be one of the things. We've got a few more we're going to add, but one of the things in notebook check number 2. Notebook check number 2, that's going to be due after the break. It's going to be due that Friday. On this Friday, I'm going to introduce an extra credit assignment. It's also going to be due that Friday. We'll have the document analysis assignment for tomorrow, and we'll probably have an SAQ when we get back from the break. That is it as far as new grades for the 6 weeks. So make sure you get everything in on time and everything that's still available for you to turn in. Please get that submitted. Lastly, retakes, makeups, all that good fun stuff on this DCA. That is going to come to an end on Thursday at 11:59 p.m. So if you haven't retaken it, if you haven't taken it yet, you need to get that stuff in because the DCA is going to close tomorrow night, or actually, I guess, Friday morning at midnight. So that's kind of where we're at. Take some good notes, pay attention. Like I said, the PowerPoint itself should be relatively brief. So, if you will, maybe put today's date. It makes a lot more sense to kind of keep things in order. Put the date, and let's put a title: Key Thinkers or Philosophers of the Enlightenment. Again, sometimes the Enlightenment is just referred to as the Age of Reason, but really that's kind of going hand in hand with the Scientific Revolution. It's a time period in our history where people are just kind of thinking about why things are the way they are. They're questioning some of the traditional teachings of the Catholic Church. They're relying more, obviously, on scientific observation. And in terms of the Enlightenment itself, they're thinking about our place in the world and how we interact with our government and the laws that government should have. Like I said, these are some of the prevailing thoughts that are going to lead to political revolutions, which are a pretty big deal. Because think about it like this, the American Revolution, that's obviously very important to our history, but it's really important to world history as well. Guys, once our 13 English colonies broke away and fought a war of independence and won against what was at that point one of, if not the most powerful nation on earth, well, it showed other colonies, other countries, that they too could rebel, that they too might be able to put in place some semblance of a democracy, which is what we were trying to do, which, if you recall, was kind of a form of government you hadn't seen a whole lot since ancient Greece and the early days of Rome. So really, the Enlightenment helps to kick off the American Revolution, and the American Revolution kicks off a lot of the other revolutions to come. So this is very important to understand. And I think that you're going to see, some of our core values really come out this time period. So pay attention. You don't need your computers. You for darn sure don't need your phones. All you need is your notebook. So please take some good notes. And here we go. Now, I'm going to start off, and I know you did definitions yesterday, but I'm going to give you a good overview of what the Enlightenment was in kind of all the very far-reaching impacts it had. I would highly suggest you copy down this whole thing. Now, it's a lot. If you want to abbreviate a little bit, that's fine. But I think if you can kind of see all the different webs that come off of it, I think it's really going to help you moving forward. Like I said, we are going to have an SAQ right after the break. Some of the Enlightenment stuff is going to be on that. And really, if you can remember this much about the Enlightenment, I think you're going to be okay moving forward as far as just a general theme. This isn't the whole thing. I'm doing it in steps. Here is a good, pretty complete definition. The Enlightenment, also known as the Age of Reason, especially when combined with the Scientific Revolution, was an intellectual and philosophical movement which dominated European thought during the 18th century, the 1700s especially. And on the board, I say the Age of Reason in general, mid-1500s to the late 1700s. Think about it like this. The Scientific Revolution, and we're talking like Isaac Newton and the laws of gravity, or Francis Bacon and, kind of the origins of scientific thought, empiricism. So some of that stuff, that goes on a little bit earlier. Nicholas Copernicus, Galileo, proving that, hey, the sun doesn't, orbit around the Earth orbits around the sun, stuff like that, the heliocentric theory. A lot of those theories are coming out of the 1500s and 1600s, but they're all based on rational thought, on observation. Well, you could kind of see the Enlightenment as an offshoot of that, except instead of focusing primarily on science, they're focusing on humanity and our place in the world. And really how we should be ruled and how we could potentially make things better. So the Age of Reason is much larger, but if we're talking about just the Enlightenment by itself, isolating it, we are mainly talking late 1600s all the way through the 1700s. It's no accident that the American Revolution kicks off in 1776. Again, they're very much interconnected. So, Age of Reason, intellectual and philosophical movement which dominated European thought during the 18th century. It centered on a range of ideas, including individual liberty, religious tolerance, representative government, and the promotion of natural law, and the use of logic and reason. It all matters. When you hear natural law, it's basically just we're born free, and there shouldn't be any sort of government or any sort of entity that takes away some of our core, unalienable freedoms, our freedom to live, our freedom to own property, our freedom to speak, our freedom to believe what we want to believe. It challenged the notions of divine right. Okay, remember, a lot of European kings, especially like in France, were claiming that they could do whatever they wanted because God put them on the throne. God chose them. And by virtue of that, their actions and their decisions are a reflection of what God wants. They say that's a bunch of nonsense. That goes hand in hand with the idea of absolute monarchy, the fact that a king or a queen can do whatever they want. They also challenged a lot of the supremacy of the Catholic Church, which by this time, especially in the 1700s, you've had the Protestant Reformation. So they're not the only Christian church in town in Western Europe, but they're still the most widespread. They're still, one of the most powerful. And they had been so powerful in Western Europe for so many generations that they had, at the very least, a lot of cultural influence. Again, in the early days, a lot of scientific thought was repressed because, it went against church teachings. Nicholas Copernicus, the first guy that said, hey, the Earth is not the center of the solar system, it's the sun. Well, because that was the opposite of what the church had already said, that guy got thrown in jail. Well, this is a time period where people are thinking beyond some of those traditional schools of thought. They're questioning just about everything. It not only directly inspired the political revolutions of the 1700s and 1800s, but it also later inspired movements for the abolition of serfdom, slavery, and women's suffrage. You guys know what suffrage is? Sometimes it can be, depending on how long the line is. What is it? It's voting rights. It's voting rights. Guys, look at these major things that we start to see kind of creep up, especially in the 1900s. Serfdom, we've talked about it. It's where, it goes back to the Middle Ages, where, somebody lives on a lord's land. They pretty much belong to that land. They belong to that person. They're not quite slaves, but they're not far from it. Obviously, and we know this from our own American history, but the history of the Americas and the broader history of the world, slavery, chattel slavery, has been, unfortunately, a terrible continuity that we've seen since kind of the beginning of civilization. And during this time period, it was very prevalent, especially in the American colonies. Well, people start to question that. Like, how can we do that? How can we do that to other human beings? There's much more of a push for some semblance of equality. And that also applies to women. Women, going back to the dawn of civilization, there's been that ever-present continuing theme of patriarchy, of women being oppressed, of women not being treated as equals, not given equal opportunities, at this point not being allowed to vote even in democratic societies that will come from a lot of these political revolutions. I mean, that's a legacy of the Enlightenment as well. So as you can see, a lot of the way that we think about, that most people think about the world today, some guaranteed freedoms, some guaranteed rights, the fact that we are all equal, a lot of the basics of that, they come out of this time period. They're at least popularized during this time period. Now we're going to move on. If you don't have the whole thing, this is on Canvas already. You can also take a picture real quick. That is perfectly fine. But we're going to move on to kind of the framework on which you're going to take your notes today. And yours does not have to look exactly like this, but it should more or less have the same information. I've picked out, 5 or 6 philosophers. Okay, let me see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, 6 philosophers, all of which were at least mentioned in the reading you did yesterday. And I've made a little chart. Okay, I've put their names, I've put the dates, I've put where they're from. You were going to put some of the things that they advocated for. And those I'm going to give to you. We're going to talk about it. I got a slide over each one of these people. So once you have the basic chart situated, you're just filling in a little bit of information. Then the video that follows may give you some more. Now, this PowerPoint, one of the reasons it's so short, I figure you already did the reading. We're going to watch the video. So I'm just hitting the high notes, just the most fundamental things that they really supported. But I think you're going to see a lot there. I think you're going to see a lot, especially reflected in some of the values that you will see in our own Declaration of Independence, in the United States Constitution, and the amendments to that Constitution. Guys, one of the things that really sets us apart as a nation is we're the first new nation that really fully embraced a lot of these ideas, that actually tried to do these things for real. People that we're talking about, they're just philosophers, they're writers, they're authors, they're thinkers, they're public speakers. They came up with a lot of really great ideas, but it's our new nation of the United States, and we're not infallible. We do a lot of really messed up things. We are far from perfect, but we at least tried to put a lot of these at the foundation of who we are. So our philosophers that we're going to talk about today, and there's more, but I just picked out some of the ones you're going to hear the most, and the ones that, man, if you see a quote from them, if you see them as the source of a document, I want you to jump to, oh, yeah, that's somebody who was around during the Enlightenment. We have John Locke, 1632 to 1704. He is English. One of the first true blue Enlightenment philosophers. A lot of the really broad ideas that he pushes for end up getting kind of built upon by later groups. We have the Baron de Montesquieu, 1689 to 1755. He is French. We have Voltaire, which was like a pen name. I forget what his real name is, but you read about it yesterday. They'll mention it in the video. 1694 to 1778. He is also French. We have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, 1712, excuse me, to 1778, also French. We have Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. He is English. And then we have Mary Wollstonecraft, A female writer, which, during these days, the fact that she came to renown, due to just the fact that history is pretty patriarchal, is pretty phenomenal in its own right. 1759 to 1797, she is English. What two countries are all these people from? Yeah, France and England. So think about it like this. France at this point is an absolute monarchy, very thoroughly Catholic. The king, like you guys read about, like Louis XIV, which is a little bit before this time. He has all the power that he needs. He can do pretty much whatever he wants. He claims to get that power from God. England, on the other hand, at this point, is not quite an absolute monarchy anymore. They've already installed Parliament, so the king's having to share his power. Parliament's very similar to our Congress. They've already signed something called the Magna Carta, which at some point you read about, and this was years and years earlier, that guaranteed, at least the noblemen, some certain basic rights. So you have one country, England, that's already started to limit the power of government to some extent. You've got another one that hasn't at all, really, that the leaders can do whatever they want. 1700s, you get the American Revolution, English colonies. Late 1700s, early 1800s, you get an internal revolution in France. So essentially what I'm trying to say is because of the conditions in these countries, you get a lot of the philosophy coming out of there. But those are also the first two new country and old country to really go through a political revolution based on these ideas. Again, history, it's all connected. It's one of the reasons the Enlightenment is just so important. Okay, I'm going to give you, about 30 more seconds. If you don't get it all down, if you don't get the dates, that's probably okay. But definitely get the names, definitely get down where they're from. Because as I said, their nationality kind of helps to explain why they believe some of what they believe. And again, if you need to take a picture, that's cool. It's also on Canvas. All right, there we go. Now what I've done, you can write down everything if you want, but I've kind of highlighted or I've underlined and bolded and put in purple the things that I think are the most significant. So if you even just write down those things, I think you're going to have some good notes on your hand. So hopefully that'll help to abbreviate things a little bit. We're going to go chronologically. Let's start with the Englishman, John Locke, 1632 to 1704. He was one of the first, not the first, but one of the first that really, in writing, challenged the traditional authority of an absolute monarch based on divine right. He says governments, kings, queens, whoever, they don't get their power from God. God didn't choose them. God didn't sit them on the throne. They're not speaking with God's voice. They're not making decisions on God's behalf. They are just men and women. Ultimately, every government gets their power from the people, not from God. He says that governments obtain their power from the consent of the governed. That basically, if the people didn't, on some level, let these governments rule, they wouldn't, because there's always going to be more people than there are leaders. Even if it's an unconscious thing, ultimately people are giving up, some of their basic freedoms for the stability of a government. They're allowing governments to be in place. And ultimately, that's how governments should operate. They should operate based on the general will of the people. He said the purpose of government is to protect natural, unalienable rights. He called them life, liberty or freedom, and property, the things that you build, the things that you own. Does that sound familiar at all? The rights of life, liberty, and property? What's that? Yeah, pursuit of happiness. Where's that come from? It's not the Bill of Rights. Not the Constitution. It's from the Declaration of Independence. Anybody know who wrote the Declaration of Independence? The primary author. There were some other people. Thomas Jefferson, future president of the United States. Huge fan of John Locke. I mean, he took some of Locke's exact verbiage, his exact terms, and put them into the Declaration. And you got to think about it, okay? So we're the 13 colonies. We decide, and we'll get into this later, we want to form a nation of our own, a different nation, a nation that is not based on tyranny, not based on the old way of doing things. He says that the British government is abusing us. So they're basically writing this declaration to the British government, to the world. Hey, this is why we're going to do our own things, because that government is not protecting our natural, unalienable rights. I wouldn't say that he plagiarized John Locke, but he came at least relatively close, because John Locke's writings were a huge inspiration. They were looking to form a new government. They were looking for some values to base it on. And it's a lot of this Enlightenment philosophy that they looked at. Another thing that John Locke, was really influential for, because he said, you know what, if a government's not getting its real power and direction from the people, if they're not protecting our lives, our liberties, our property, if they're violating our unalienable rights, which we have those rights as a part of natural law. It's just we're born with them. That no one should be able to take them away. That we as a people have a right to revolt and create something new. He says we not only have the right, we have the duty to rebel. That's a powerful thought, especially, years later when these colonies are wanting to do just that. He says it's not just your right, it's your duty to rebel, do something better, make something better. So that's John Locke for you. Very, very influential. Next, we go off to the Frenchman, the Baron de Montesquieu, who has a much longer name, but again, I don't remember it. 1689 to 1755. His book, The Spirit of Laws, encouraged the development of a system of checks and balances. Does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Yeah. By creating separate legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government in order to prevent tyranny. Now, he's coming out of France that didn't have this. They had an absolute monarch. He's saying, when you've got someone that's got all the power in the world, that's going to corrupt them. That just makes sense. Maybe we should have different branches of government. And he kind of saw what was going on in England. They kind of were starting to go this way. And he probably looked to the past. This is essentially what the early Roman Republic did. And he said, that's how you do it. So later on, we rebel, and I'm saying we as in, the American colonies, and we managed to win the American Revolution. Finally, we've got a country of our own. We got to figure out how we're going to set up the foundation of our government. That's what the Constitution does. And what do? Well, we set up separate legislative, judicial, and executive branches of government. Again, that's why you got to know about the Enlightenment, the philosophies, the ideas. They end up very much influencing the people that founded our nation. Next, Voltaire. And I know I'm moving kind of fast, but again, this is all on canvas, and you can take pictures. 1694 to 1778. He was more of an author, and he really made fun of a lot of the traditional powers of the church, of the nobility. It actually got him ran off out of France for a while. He had to move to England, where he witnessed at least some limitations to government, at least a fundamentally freer society. His big, push in his writings were freedom of speech and freedom of religion. He said, you should be able to say whatever you feel, even if I don't agree with that. I've got a quote over there from him, which I'll paraphrase, but he says something to the extent, it's a really famous quote. I don't agree with what you say, but I'll fight to the death to protect your right to be able to say it. Again, you look at our U.S. Constitution, which, before it could be ratified by the 13 states, they wanted certain guaranteed rights, put in there. So you get the Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech is one of the first things that they put in. So is freedom of religion. That was the thing, in our country from the beginning, you could believe whatever you wanted to believe, theoretically. And a lot of times, people say, well, we were founded as a Christian nation. And to some extent, that's correct, because a lot of the people that came over here were Christian, but not all of them. And frankly, the founders of our nation, and really most of these Enlightenment philosophers, wouldn't be considered Christians. They were called deists. Did you guys read about deism yesterday?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was one of the definitions you did, which essentially was a very, I don't know, it's almost a scientific look at religion. It said, hey, there is a God, but God doesn't really have much to do with us, here on earth and what goes on. He doesn't interact a whole lot. He doesn't change a whole lot. He's more like a clockmaker. He made the world, and he made us, and he instilled in us a sense of good and evil, and then he kind of went off and did him. It's not that he's not around, he is, but all these different religions and the prayers and stuff, that's not so much what it's all about. Thomas Jefferson was not a Christian. He was a deist. A lot of our founding fathers lean more towards deism than Christianity, and certainly these Enlightenment philosophers, by and large, did. It's not anti-religious, but it's definitely a different view of things. But either way, he said, hey, believe what you want to believe. And that's something that, at its core, our nation was founded on. And again, just write down the stuff in purple. It'll be a lot easier for you. Next, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, which is just fun to say, 1712 to 1778. So he's coming a little bit later on, especially from John Locke. He builds off a lot of his ideas. He believed that a government should express the general will of the people. Theoretically, like Locke said, the power to govern comes from the consent of the governed, right? Well, theoretically, the government should act on our behest. It should go with what we want. Now, we know in reality that doesn't always happen, but that's how a democracy, a democratic republic, should work. Now, we don't get to make any decisions ourselves, unfortunately, but we at least get to pick our leaders, and hopefully we vote for leaders that have values similar to ours, and they will therefore make judgments similar to what we would. Okay, so that's kind of how we chose to enact this. But that makes sense. His book, The Social Contract, and Locke had talked about the social contract, but he actually has a book called it, helped inspire the democratic ideals of the French Revolution. This concept states that people give up some power and freedom for the stability and protection governments give us. That's the social contract. We allow the government to rule, and that means we're giving up some freedom. We can't just do whatever the heck we want. We got to follow laws. But we do that for the order and the stability and the protection that governments provide. But again, if they're not doing that, if they're abusing their powers, if they're taking away our unalienable rights, well, then they're not expressing the general will of the people, and they need to be replaced. Next, Adam Smith, 1723 to 1790. We're going to talk about this guy a lot later. But here's some basics that you need to know. This guy challenged mercantilism. And remember, that was the overarching economic philosophy of the day. That's what, colonialism was based on. Stockpiling the gold and silver, export more than you import. It was very much directed by the government. He responds to that by laying the foundation for what will become capitalism. The economic philosophy that the United States adheres the most to. It's not pure anymore, but the most to. And he does this in a book called The Wealth of Nations. Real basics about capitalism, free enterprise, a market economy. They're all the same thing. He explained how competition, the laws of supply and demand, and the division of labor help to guide a free market economic system based on self-interest. He argued that the government should follow and this is probably the most important term to get down, a laissez-faire or hands-off policy towards the economy. Essentially, he said mercantilism, a lot of the government activities are directed, or a lot of the business activities, I should say, are directed by the government. No. The best way to build a wealth of nations is have everybody compete work in their own interests, try to do better than everybody else, try to, make wise business decisions. And through this competition, the cream is going to rise to the top. And ultimately, nations will be wealthier and more successful because of that. He basically says, give the people economic freedom. The government needs to keep its hands off the economy. That's what laissez-faire means. And that's one of the central tenets of capitalism. The government doesn't regulate the economy too much. Now, that's pure capitalism. Nowadays, even though we still consider ourselves largely a capitalist nation, it's not exactly like that anymore. There's been a lot of blending of ideas since. And we'll get into economic theory a little bit later, especially when we do Industrial Revolution. But this at least serves as the foundation. So everybody else is talking more political freedom. He's talking more economic freedom. And capitalism obviously is going to be a driving force in world affairs moving forward. Our last one, and then we'll watch our video and be done. Mary Wollstonecraft, 1759 to 1797. She is best known for writing a book, or an essay really, A Vindication of the Rights of Women, 1792, in which she argues that women, are not naturally inferior to men, but appear to be only because they lack education. Now, we look at this now, it's like, duh, we're equals. Men, women, people of all colors and creed, we're all just human beings, we're equally capable. But back then, that's not how a lot of people thought. Well, she's saying no. Women maybe at this point aren't achieving as much, but it's because they don't have the opportunities to do so. They're not provided the education that a lot of men are. And that's really what she pushes for, equal opportunities, especially in the realms of education. She believed that both men and women should be treated as rational beings and that women should have the same rights as men. Now, this is kind of the beginnings of a growing feminist movement that we're going to see, especially later on in the 1800s and the 1900s. You start to see more and more women at first, push for equal rights, especially like the right to vote, the women's suffrage movement. In U.S. history, you'll talk about this a decent amount. You probably talked about it in 8th grade. One of the things you may have talked about was like the Seneca Falls Convention. That's worth knowing. In New York, 1848, one of the first big feminist conventions that was organized by two famous feminist advocates of the women's suffrage movement, Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which, again, at some point you'll probably have to learn about again. Again, you could see her at the forefront of what will eventually grow into a big-time feminist movement, which, I think that we see echo until this day, when we're still talking about, gender inequality. So those are the ones. Those are the ones to know. Definitely know their names. Definitely associate them with this time period. And again, I think if you could see the things that they were really talking about, the things that they were writing about, the ideas that they were popularizing, you can see the historical impact that they had. You can see that these are things that really move forward quite a bit and that we're still talking about to this day. Now, this one I would say you don't have to write down because we went over it. But you may want to take a picture of it. I don't know. It kind of summarizes a lot of Enlightenment ideas about government. In the economy, laissez-faire, let it be. The goals of government, protect us, provide justice, protect our unalienable rights. The purpose of government, protect the natural rights, like I said. When government fails, we have the right to overthrow that government, create something new. The power of government shouldn't be absolute. It should be limited. It should be limited by us. One of the ways you do that is by not putting absolute power in anybody's hand, by kind of breaking the branches of government apart, so you have a system of checks and balances. And ultimately, one of the key ideas of the Enlightenment is the power of the government ultimately comes from us. A government can only remain in power if by our consent, because we have the natural right and the power to overthrow them if we unify and we so choose. So that's the gist of it. And again, pretty brief, but you need to understand it because these different philosophers, in French, the philosophes, I think it's pronounced, they really kind of set the tone for man, a lot of what's to come, a lot of the political revolutions we're going to get into. All right, we got one last thing. It's crash course. he gets into some pretty good depth. You don't necessarily got to add a whole lot more notes, but I think they're going to add some details that certainly the book or myself didn't really get into. Again, just watch it if nothing else. Watch it, kind of gain an understanding of just how influential this was. In this one, he actually talks a little bit slow, so we're gonna move it up to 1.25. I think he did this is from AP Europe or European history rather than like world and US. So he does get into a lot more detail, but I think when he did world history, he talks so fast that later on when he did European, he's like, I gotta slow it down. Well, that's cool. We only got that much time left, so we're gonna speed it up just a tiny bit, but not so much that you miss anything he's saying. So pay attention, stay awake, stay off the phone. When this is done, we'll be done for the day.
Hi, I'm John Green, and this is Crash Course European History. So far, we've seen a ton of political change and continuing warfare in the midst of the 17th century's Little Ice Age. History often focuses on those types of political and military stories, but there were also other changes occurring, shifts in how people perceived the everyday world. Like the linking of phenomena such as earthquakes and eclipses with human events goes back a very long way, like to the beginning of our species, as does the belief that supernatural forces are deeply shaping the